The term cowboy originates from earlier words referring to both age and cattle-related work. It evolved from vaquero, a Spanish term for someone managing cattle on horseback, which itself came from vaca, meaning cow in Spanish. The term cowboy was first seen in print in 1725 by Jonathan Swift. It gained traction in the British Isles between 1820 and 1850 to describe young boys tending to cows. Initially, cowherd was the common term for a cattle herder, similar to a shepherd for sheep, and usually referred to young boys working on foot. This term has been in use since before the year 1000 AD. By 1849, cowboy was widely used, though other terms like cowhands, drovers, or stockmen were also used, particularly in the American Southwest. Variations like cowhand emerged around 1852 and cowpoke in 1881, originally used for those guiding cattle onto railroad cars for shipping. In American English, synonyms for cowboy include buckaroo, cowpoke, cowhand, and cowpuncher. Specifically, buckaroo is an anglicized form of vaquero. Both historical and modern cowboys usually started working as adolescents, earning wages as soon as they were skilled enough to be hired, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. Some cowboys handle cattle or horses throughout their lives, and in the United States, a few women also participated in ranching and acquired necessary skills, although the recognition of the term cowgirl didn't become widespread until the late 19th century. During the American Revolution, the term cowboy had a different meaning than what we typically associate with it today. It was used to describe Americans who opposed the movement for independence. One notable figure, Claudius Smith, known as the Cowboy of the Ramapos, was an outlaw linked with the Loyalist cause. He earned this title by stealing oxen, cattle, and horses from colonists and giving them back to the British. In the same era, guerrilla bands operated in Westchester County, a region between British and American forces. These groups were composed of local farm workers who ambushed convoys and carried out raids for both sides. Two distinct factions emerged: the Skinners, who fought for independence, and the Cowboys, who supported the British. Moving forward to the 1880s in Tombstone, Arizona, the term cowboy took on another negative connotation. It was used disparagingly to describe men involved in various criminal activities. One such group, known simply as the Cowboys, engaged in smuggling cattle, alcohol, and tobacco across the US-Mexico border. Residents viewed cowboys as rustlers, bandits, and outlaws. Calling someone a cowboy in that area implied that they were involved in horse theft or robbery. Cattlemen, on the other hand, were referred to as herders or ranchers. Other synonyms for cowboy included ranch hand, range hand, or trail hand, although their duties and wages weren't always identical. The activities of the cowboys were eventually brought to an end by the famous gunfight at the OK Corral and subsequent actions known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. The roots of the cowboy tradition trace back to Spain, originating from the hacienda system of medieval times. This style of cattle ranching spread across the Iberian Peninsula and was later introduced to the Americas. Both regions shared a similar dry climate with limited grass, requiring vast expanses of land to sustain large cattle herds. The necessity to cover long distances beyond what could be managed on foot led to the development of the horseback-mounted vaquero. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors and settlers brought their cattle-raising customs, along with horses and domesticated cattle, to the Americas. This began with the arrival in present-day Mexico and Florida. These traditions from Spain underwent changes due to the different geographical, environmental, and cultural conditions of the New World, which later became Mexico and the southwestern United States. Likewise, the land and people of the Americas experienced significant transformations due to Spanish influence. The introduction of horses was particularly impactful, as horses had been absent from the Americas since the end of the prehistoric Ice Age. Horses quickly multiplied and became essential to the success of the Spanish and subsequent settlers from other nations. Although often associated with American culture, the traditional cowboy originated from the Spanish tradition, which further evolved into the vaquero of northern Mexico and the charro of regions like Jalisco and Michoacan. While most ranch owners were Spanish criollos, many early vaqueros were Native Americans trained to work for Spanish missions, caring for mission herds. Vaqueros traveled north with livestock, with notable expeditions like Don Juan de Oñate's in 1598, which brought 7,000 head of cattle into New Mexico. From there, vaqueros drove cattle from New Mexico and later Texas to Mexico City. Mexican traditions spread both south and north, influencing equestrian customs from Argentina all the way up to Canada. As English-speaking traders and settlers moved westward, they encountered a blend of English and Spanish traditions, language, and culture. Before the Mexican-American War in 1848, New England merchants sailing to California traded manufactured goods for hides and tallow from extensive cattle ranches, owned by hacendados and managed by vaqueros. American traders along what later became the Santa Fe Trail also interacted with vaquero life. These early interactions marked the beginning of the transformation in the lifestyle and language of the vaquero, merging with English cultural norms to form what we know now as the cowboy in American culture. The influx of English-speaking settlers in Texas began in about 1821. Rip Ford noted the presence of numerous herds of wild mustangs and cattle left behind by Mexicans ordered to evacuate by General Valentin Canalizo. These abandoned horses and cattle became targets for raids by Texans. California saw a similar pattern, with significant settler migration occurring after the Mexican-American War. Both regions contributed to the development of the American cowboy, especially with the rise of railroads and the increased demand for beef following the Civil War. This demand led to cattle being driven from ranches to railheads, often over long distances. Black cowboys played a significant role in the American West, making up to 25% of workers in the range cattle industry from the 1860s to the 1880s. Many of these cowboys were formerly enslaved or children of those enslaved who possessed skills in cattle handling acquired during and after the Civil War. By the 1880s, the expansion of the cattle industry necessitated more open range, prompting ranchers to move into the Northwest, where vast grasslands remained unsettled. Texas cattle were herded northward into the Rocky Mountain West and into the Dakotas. Cowboys adjusted their gear to suit colder conditions, and this westward movement led to the blending of regional traditions from California to Texas, with cowboys incorporating the most practical elements from each. Mustang runners, also known as mestañeros, were cowboys and vaqueros tasked with capturing, taming, and driving mustangs to market in Mexico and later in American territories, like northern Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and California. They rounded up wild mustangs across the Great Plains, the San Joaquin Valley of California, and eventually the Great Basin from the 18th century to the early 20th century. A significant number of cattle roamed freely on the open range, sometimes without much human supervision for most of the year. Ranchers often formed groups and allowed their cattle to graze together on shared land. To keep track of individual animals, they marked them with unique symbols using a hot iron, typically while the cattle were still young calves. To identify and manage the cattle, ranchers held roundups, usually in the spring. This required specialized skills from both cowboys and their horses. Those responsible for separating cattle needed exceptional abilities and rode specially trained cutting horses that could swiftly respond to the movements of cattle, stopping and turning quickly. Once the cattle were sorted, cowboys roped young calves to brand them, and, in most cases, castrated male calves. Occasionally, older cattle also needed to be restrained for branding or other treatments. A considerable number of horses were essential for roundup, with each cowboy needing 3 to 4 fresh horses in just a single day's work. Horses themselves were rounded up as well. It was common for young foals to be born to domesticated mares, but allowed to grow up wild on the open range. Both types of horses were gathered, and the mature ones were trained, a process known as horse breaking or bronco busting, usually performed by specialized cowboy horse trainers. While some cowboys used harsh methods to tame horses, others opted for gentler approaches, recognizing the benefits of humane treatment. They often adopted techniques from the vaqueros, particularly those from California tradition. Horses trained in a gentler manner proved to be more reliable and useful for various tasks. Through the necessary tasks of the working cowboy, informal competitions emerged among cowboys eager to showcase their skills in handling cattle and horses. From these competitions, the sport of rodeo gradually evolved. Before the mid-19th century, most ranchers raised cattle primarily for their own use and to sell extra meat and hides locally. There were also some demand for other cattle parts like hides, horns, hooves, and tallow in various industries. However, the demand for beef was quite low until after the American Civil War. After the war, Philip Danforth Armour opened a meatpacking plant in Chicago, which led to a surge in the demand for beef. By 1866, cattle could fetch as much as $40 per head in northern markets, making it profitable to drive cattle long distances for sale, especially from places like Texas, where cattle was abundant. The first major cattle drive from Texas to a railroad for shipment occurred in 1866, aiming for Sedalia, Missouri. However, farmers in eastern Kansas were worried that the cattle might spread diseases to local animals or damage crops, so they threatened to harm any cattlemen found on their land. This led to the drive failing to reach the railroad, resulting in low cattle prices. A year later, in 1867, a cattle shipping station was established near Abilene, Kansas, which became a central point for cattle shipping. This route from Texas to Abilene became known as the Chisholm Trail, named after Jesse Chisholm, who marked out the path himself. Other trails branched off to different railheads, including Dodge City and Wichita, Kansas. By 1877, Dodge City alone shipped out 500,000 head of cattle. Cattle drives had to find a balance between speed and the health of the cattle. While they could cover up to 25 miles in a day, doing so would make the cattle lose too much weight to sell well. Typically, they traveled shorter distances each day, resting and grazing at midday and at night. On average, a herd could travel about 15 miles per day, taking around 2 months to reach a railhead. A typical cattle drive consisted of around 3,000 head of cattle and required at least 10 cowboys, each with 3 horses. Cowboys worked in shifts around the clock to watch the cattle, herding them during the day and keeping watch at night to prevent stampedes and theft. The crew also included a cook who managed a chuck wagon, usually pulled by an oxen, and a horse wrangler who looked after the spare horses. The cook was highly respected, as besides preparing meals, they also handled medical supplies and often had in-depth medical knowledge. In the 1880s, the invention of barbed wire revolutionized cattle management by allowing ranchers to confine cattle to specific areas, preventing overgrazing of the land. In Texas and nearby regions, a growing population meant ranchers had to fence off their own lands to maintain control over their own cattle. In the northern areas, the open range was suffering from overgrazing, which led to a shortage of winter food for the cattle. This problem was particularly severe during the harsh winter of 1886 and 1887, when hundreds of thousands of cattle died across the Northwest, causing the collapse of the cattle industry in those regions. By the 1890s, barbed wire fencing had become common in the northern plains. Railroads had expanded across much of the country, and meatpacking plants were established closer to major ranching areas. This made long cattle drives from Texas to Kansas railheads unnecessary. Consequently, the era of the open range came to an end, and large cattle drives ceased to exist. However, smaller cattle drives continued at least until the 1940s. Ranchers still needed to herd cattle to local railheads for transport to stockyards and packing plants, as modern cattle trucks had not yet been developed. Despite the decline of large-scale cattle drives, ranching remained a significant industry in the developing West. This ensured continued employment for cowboys, albeit with relatively low wages, but also brought a degree of stability to their lives as the industry became more settled. American cowboys came from diverse backgrounds. In the late 1860s, after the Civil War, and during the growth of the cattle industry, many former soldiers from both the Union and the Confederacy headed west in search of work. Alongside them, a large number of restless white men also migrated westward seeking opportunities. African American freedmen were also attracted to cowboy life, partly because there was less racial discrimination in the West compared to other parts of the country during Reconstruction. Additionally, many Mexicans and Native Americans who were already living in the region worked as cowboys. In the late 19th century, American policy aimed for the assimilation of Native Americans, leading some indigenous boarding schools to teach ranching skills. Today, some Native Americans in the western United States own cattle and small ranches, and many continue to work as cowboys, especially on ranches near Indian reservations. The Native American cowboy is also a part of the rodeo circuit. Due to their low status in society at the time, there are no precise figures on the racial makeup of cowboys. Census records suggest that around 15 to 25% of all cowboys were African American, with higher percentages on trail drives out of Texas and fewer in the Northwest. Similarly, cowboys of Mexican descent also accounted for about 15% of the total, with higher concentrations in Texas and the Southwest. Regardless of their ethnicity, most cowboys came from lower social classes, and their pay was meager. On average, a cowboy earned about $1 per day, along with meals and lodging in the bunkhouse. Typically a simple, open room resembling barracks, especially when near the home ranch. As time passed, the cowboys of the western United States developed their own unique culture, blending frontier toughness with Victorian values and even a hint of chivalry. The challenging and often solitary nature of their work fostered a sense of self-reliance and individualism, where personal integrity was highly prized and celebrated in songs and poetry. Cowboys typically worked in male-dominated environments, especially during cattle drives, when men greatly outnumbered women in the frontier West. In such circumstances, some men formed close bonds with each other, drawn together by the shared challenges of frontier life. Social gatherings that usually included both men and women sometimes became all male due to the scarcity of women in the region. In these situations, men would partner up with each other for dances and other social activities. It's worth noting that in some cases, romantic relationships between young, unmarried men did occur, particularly in areas where men outnumbered women. However, despite these instances, cowboy culture itself was, and still often is, strongly opposed to homosexuality. Although laws against homosexual behavior existed in the Old West, they were actually not consistently enforced. The rise of the cattle industry coincided with the emergence of cowboy imagery, which held significant influence. In the tumultuous years following the Civil War, Democrats, particularly those from the South, viewed the West as a refuge from the Republican politicians they opposed. They painted a romanticized picture of cowboys as hardworking, honorable individuals who lived by their own rules, relying on themselves rather than the government. Democratic newspapers portrayed cowboy life as adventurous and noble, contrasting it with what they saw as the negative effects of big government and the supposed laziness of former enslaved folks. The romanticized image of the cowboy was further ingrained in the public consciousness through Wild West shows in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These spectacles glorified the lives of cowboys and Native Americans, but perpetuated stereotypes while also showcasing their rugged lifestyles. Western films from Hollywood in the 1920s and onward continued to popularize the cowboy archetype, often portraying them as rough and tough gunslingers. However, some actors, like Gene Autry, promoted values of honor, respect, and patriotism through their portrayals of cowboys. Historians often suggest a link between the romanticized cowboy code and the rowdy cowboy image, which they trace back to the subculture of violence among drivers in Old West Texas, influenced by the Southern Code of Honor. In many Western films, cowboys were depicted fighting against Native Americans, although most conflicts between settlers and Native peoples were actually with the U.S. Army. However, relations between cowboys and Native Americans were often strained, with occasional friendly interactions, but more commonly unfriendly encounters. Native peoples sometimes allowed cattle herds to pass through their territories for a fee, but would raid drives and ranches during periods of conflict or scarcity. Cowboys were armed to protect against both natural predators and human thieves, using their guns to defend their cattle regardless of the attacker's race. In reality, ranch hands had little time for anything other than the demanding work required to maintain a ranch. The diverse geography, climate, and cultural backgrounds across the United States led to distinct variations in cattle handling methods and equipment used among cowboys. Between 1840 and 1870, as English and French settlers moved westward beyond the Mississippi River, they encountered Spanish-descended populations from territories that later became Texas and California. The mingling of cultures gave rise to two primary cowboy traditions, known today as the Texas and Spanish, Vaquero, or California traditions. Lesser known but equally unique cowboy traditions also emerged in Hawaii and Florida. While regional differences in equipment and riding styles persist, some individuals deliberately preserve the highly skilled techniques of the pure Vaquero or Buckaroo tradition. The Vaquero, or California tradition, originated in the 18th century. These cowboys specialized in working with young, untrained horses and thrived in Alta California and neighboring territories during the Spanish colonial period. Unlike the Texas cowboy, the California Vaquero, or Buckaroo, was considered highly skilled and typically remained on the same ranch where they were born, raising their families there as well. The California landscape allowed for more intensive grazing and localized cattle marketing, shaping a distinct horse and livestock handling culture with a stronger Spanish influence than that of Texas. In the Texas tradition, cattle herding on horseback began in Spanish Texas in the 18th century and continued after Texas independence, with settlers incorporating elements of Mexican vaquero culture. Following the Civil War, the vaquero culture blended with southeastern United States cattle herding traditions as settlers moved westward, leading to further adaptations in equipment and techniques. Texas cowboys typically moved between different outfits seasonally and were influenced by the need to conduct long cattle drives to reach the market. The Florida cowhunter, or cracker cowboy, of the 19th and early 20th centuries had a distinct approach from both Texas and California traditions. They relied on bullwhips and dogs for herding, rather than lassos, and many did not use Western saddles, instead favoring McClellan saddles. The unique Florida landscape and history, including conflicts with Native American tribes and the importation of cattle from Spanish Florida, shaped their distinctive practices. In Hawaii, the Paniolo, or Hawaiian cowboy, directly descended from the vaquero tradition of California and Mexico. They learned their skills from Mexican vaqueros and played a crucial role in the island's cattle industry. The term Paniolo likely derives from the Spanish word español and reflects the influence of Mexican-Spanish culture on Hawaiian ranching practices. Traditional Paniolo attire and tools bear distinct Mexican-Spanish characteristics as well. It goes without saying, Old West cowboys were a diverse group, drawing from various cultural backgrounds and regional traditions across the United States. They were skilled horsemen and livestock handlers, shaping their practices according to the geography, climate, and cultural influences of their respective regions. From all corners of the frontier, each cowboy tradition had its own unique techniques and equipment, reflecting a blend of Spanish, Mexican, and Anglo-American influences. Despite differences in approach, cowboys shared common values of hard work, self-dependence, and individualism. While romanticized in popular culture, the reality of cowboy life involved long hours, hazardous conditions, and modest pay. Nonetheless, the legacy of the Old West cowboy endures, symbolizing resilience, resourcefulness, and the spirit of adventure that helped shape the American frontier.